Welcome to Trending in Education. I always love having people back, and it's for a good reason. I am joined today by Dr. C. Edward Watson, also known as Eddie Watson. I'll be referring to him as Eddie in the conversation. He's got a lot going on, but first and foremost, there's a book that I read the first edition of. There's an episode we'll include in the show notes that really popped. It's called Teaching with AI, A Practical Guide to a New Era of Human Learning. And that was May of 2024 when that episode went out, and we're all aging in dog years. The innovation cycles are very fast. So Eddie and his co-author, Jose Antonio Bowen, have authored a second edition. Eddie's holding it up right now. Welcome back to Trending in Education.
Michael, we had a great conversation last time, so I'm excited to be here again.
Yeah, exactly. And hopefully folks have heard it. And, when we were setting up, the nice thing about the conversation, I think you used the word durable. It did feel like there was some durability there where even though the technology is moving really fast, there are ways to approach the problem and approach your thinking about it that actually is resilient to change. It's adaptable, it's flexible. And that's what I was impressed with the first version of the book. And now you're back with a second edition. For folks who may not know you, can you give a sort of an abbreviated origin story, and then we'll get right into what's going on with the book?
Yeah, well, I was on campuses for 20 years. My last position was at the University of Georgia. I was the director of the Center for Teaching and Learning.
Go Bulldogs.
It's a good time of year for the Bulldogs. So I'm now the vice president for digital innovation at the American Association of Colleges and Universities. I've been at AAC&U for over 8 years now.
Yeah. And in an innovation role, we talked at least a bit last time about how you've been called a futurist, although I like to think of you as almost a reluctant futurist. It's like the way I feel about calling myself a thought leader. It's like, get over yourself. But there's an element of looking ahead that's kind of baked into your job and what you've been doing. And then that leads directly into, AI hits the scene in November of 2022. And then within a year and change, this new book is out, first edition. And now about the same amount of time that passed between the launch of ChatGPT and the release of the first edition has now passed between then and the December release of the second edition. Dropping like it's hot. We'll include a link in the show notes for folks who want to stay on top of all this stuff. Can you talk about that progression? Because, I like to say ChatGPT is now a three-nager. It's entering a new phase in its development. In fact, its primacy relative to Gemini and Claude and other things that are emerging is also an interesting development now too, where there is a bit of a race happening among the different models that are out there. But how would you characterize where we are and sort of maybe a quick look at what the first year and a half was? But then I'm really interested in how you and Jose have been tackling what's happened since, because there's been quite a bit of development.
I think we're still on an innovation curve. I don't think that things have leveled off. We're seeing some shifts in sort of like higher education's scope of interest. I mean, the first year or maybe even longer, the only conversation that we had was around academic integrity, that AI could be used for cheating.
Yep.
And then we began to see that, there might actually be some ways that faculty themselves could leverage AI to actually improve student learning outcomes and the like. But then also there's this shift within the world of work where there have been a lot of sectors that have adopted AI in various ways. And if we all agree that at least part of the purpose of higher education is to prepare students for life beyond graduation, including the world of work, right, our curriculum should be preparing students for that world. So there's these multiple layers. It's like academic integrity concerns, and then you've got these other concerns around the world of work and how we might leverage them ourselves. And we at AAC&U, we have an Institute on AI Pedagogy in the curriculum. And right now we have 191 campus teams participating in sort of like this work focused on specifically how to integrate AI into the curriculum, faculty development, preparing students around AI literacy. However, with that said, that's the institutional interest. We did a survey this fall of faculty, and the number one concern still today for faculty in the classroom, academic integrity and cheating.
That's interesting. Yeah. And I appreciate you putting the world of work out as a contrast perhaps to the world of academia and higher ed, because I think it's meaningful where, the trope that's been out there for a while is AI is not going to take your job. Someone using AI is going to take your job. Interestingly, I don't think I've heard that discussed as much in higher ed, but I imagine it's kind of seeping in. And even the academic integrity argument in some ways is almost a way to kind of forestall what I would view as the inevitable, where eventually we're all going to have to assimilate the fact that the world has changed and these models are here really for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, I think so, but I think the academic integrity concerns aren't just like resistance measures by those that
Yep.
don't want to have to engage. I
Mhm.
think they're very real. I
Yep.
mean, these are key challenges and things that we have used in the past that we have found, evidence-based practice around the value of writing to
Yep.
promote learning, absolutely present, but yet AI can circumvent that. And it's very difficult to tell whether or not AI produced text or whether students produce text. In fact, I was having a conversation with students a couple of weeks back, and students who are better writers say that they try to dumb down their writing because they're afraid if they sound too academic or too advanced that they might be flagged by AI detection tools. At least that's their
Right.
emerging beliefs around AI detection. So, students are really struggling within this space, but faculty are as well. I think faculty that are leaning into teaching students how to use AI well, thinking about preparing them for life beyond graduation, are also still struggling with how can I have confidence that this work that I'm now grading was indeed produced solely by the student or the students followed the guidelines of the assignment. I mean, it's incredibly thorny even for those that are the most positive proponents of AI.
Right. And the risks are real too. So, like, I don't think we want to be Pollyanna-ish in terms of using this stuff. Like, there's risks around using it. There's certainly challenges. I always call it, as the parent of a 6-year-old, soon to be 7-year-old, I always call it the training wheels problem, where, if you rely on this stuff too much. A guest recently, Carlo Rotella, was saying, using AI to write a paper is like using a robot to lift your weights at the gym. The purpose of writing the paper is to really develop your thinking and your perspective, get deeper into a topic. When you offload that, I tend to quote Charles and Ray Eames on this too: never delegate understanding, but the reality is kids can do it, and the models have gotten a lot better too. Like, that's another thing that has really changed in the last year and a half. I've been blown away by the latest version of Gemini. Gemini 3 has been a breakthrough where it felt like Google was a little bit behind, and the AI race is on, and in some ways it's benefiting us as end users, but it certainly doesn't make some of the more complicated questions higher ed is facing go away. How are you thinking about all that?
Well, I mean, the best advice for faculty is sort of like a lot of what we already know about what motivates students to cheat.
Yeah.
If it's a really high stakes assignment, then students will feel more pressure and may be more inclined to cheat. So maybe it's always been a best practice that rather than giving like the midterm and the final that are each worth 35% of the final grade, maybe we shouldn't have anything that's more than 10 to 15% of the final grade, to diminish sort of students' motivation. To cheat. I mean, if you feel like you're going to fail the whole course, if you fail that exam or you get a low grade on that paper just on that one Tuesday,
Yeah.
it's kind of a motivator to maybe think about what I could do to get the best grade I could possibly get.
Right.
There's a lot of things that we've known about students' choices to cheat, for decades.
Yeah.
And it'll come to play now. So I think we should lean back into that and make sure that our classroom practice aligns with it.
That's interesting. Yeah. I mean, in some ways, if I'm hearing you right, we've had a long-standing academic integrity problem that was sort of pulled forward in its priority and its awareness because there was no ignoring it anymore. Where I was even reading recently about, schools with honor codes. I think Stanford, among others, has recently changed the honor code, in part responding to surveys of students that were basically saying the majority of students are using, unethical assistance, and, it becomes almost a moral hazard to the university. And then students themselves feel like they have to cheat just to keep up within that competitive context. And AI is everywhere nowadays.
Yeah, I've heard that as well. Students who have never been inclined to cheat now feel like they're at a competitive disadvantage because they know that they've got peers that are using those tools. And they're like, me by myself, if this professor's grading on a curve and other people are going to be throwing the curve off because they're leveraging AI, then, are they basically, making a poor decision by not using AI to ensure that whatever they turn in is of the best possible quality. So the calculus is not just a calculus that faculty are performing. Students are really struggling with. I mean, even the most honest of our students are really struggling with what's the best thing that they should do for their own education and their own, future lives, their future careers.
Yeah. And more speaking to your specific audience around, people who are designing curricula and trying to understand how do I structure an assignment, there has been some evolution there as well. There are some places, where, Ethan Mollick is the guy I look to for a lot of this stuff, where the assignment will begin with, you will use the AI to come up with a draft. And that is sort of baked into the assignment. Granted, he's teaching folks how to use AI, so it makes sense in that context. But, there is almost a reframing of the design of the assessments and the assignments themselves that almost needs to be intentional and thoughtful about whether AI can and should be used and then how.
Yeah, I mean, I think it kind of just pushes us back to just good instructional design. There's a fairly simple model called backward design where it's like, okay, what is it you want your students to learn? What's the learning outcome? What does that look like?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, then you put together the assignment that would, the students complete the assignment. It would show what their competency level is with that particular learning outcome.
Yeah.
And then you backward engineer to then, well, what is the instruction that you then provide the students so that they can perform or do that assignment well?
Mm-hmm.
But the learning outcome drives this. So if your learning outcome is around develop AI literacy skills, of course, the assignment's going to have AI baked into it. But,
Right.
If you're teaching a freshman writing class and I want my students to learn how to write well,
Right.
then, baking AI in for drafts may not be the best place to start.
Mm-hmm.
It depends on, there's this notion of learning to write, which our freshman writing classes often teach. And then we've got this notion of writing to learn. Like you actually use writing as a learning process to learn the course content, and you aren't necessarily grading, their writing competency. But
Right.
it really depends on the learning outcome and whether or not AI should be in there, or whether it shouldn't be. And then there's different faculty perspectives on how to achieve that learning outcome. So even
Right.
the same section of that same sociology course taught by two different professors with two different perspectives, one may have a very efficacious path that involves AI. And then there may be another faculty member that's like, I've taught this well throughout my career. I want to put structures and guidelines in place to make sure that students continue to do the work. I mean, one of the metaphors within the CTL world is you often hear the one who does the work is the one who does the learning.
Yeah.
So how do we make sure that our students are doing the work? Because that's where the learning occurs.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that does remind me of, never delegate understanding. I've also heard understanding described as a labor, and that you actually have to do the hard work. It's desirable difficulty, but it's difficult. It's productive struggle, but it's a struggle. And I think lots of folks kind of in the world of work, there's not always as much value in the struggle necessarily if you're really being measured based on the outcomes. What I find interesting in what you're talking about around higher ed is that you could almost think about stuff in more of an ongoing formative way. Formative assessments versus summative ones is something that people have talked about for years. And when you just have that, one shot, high stakes thing at the end, it does create more of that, especially in a competitive landscape. It can create a lot more of that almost pressure to cheat or pressure to kind of push boundaries to kind of get somewhere, as opposed to if some of these tools are understood as tools. And if you're thoughtful about how you talk about how you can and cannot use these tools as a student, I imagine that's where a lot of the evolution of the thinking is heading.
This story that I'm going to share predates generative AI, but my oldest son, when he was in college, his last semester, there was a course he was taking where there was one project due on the last day of class, and it was worth 100% of the final grade.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I didn't say this out loud, but I was thinking, if you're ever going to cheat, that's the one to do it on, right? Because it's all or nothing,
Right,
So
right.
I'm sure that the motivation, the pressure that the student would feel, I think, number one, would the dissonance for the learning process. But
Yeah.
I just don't think that may have been the best possible, assessment strategy that could have been employed in that course.
Yeah. And Are the assessments evolving? Like this technology, I think, is at a place where it's forcing us to rethink things. I've heard folks talk about, could you use a chatbot as an example? Agentic AI is probably something we should get into because it's certainly matured in the last year and a half. And I think looking ahead, it's something that I think more folks are going to need to wrap their heads around. But I've heard folks ask the question of, rather than write a long essay by myself without any interaction, could my chats over the course of a semester sort of feed into my final grade? And could the AI that I'm chatting with help me with that assessment or help the instructor with that assessment? Those types of ideas are sort of circulating. You have, sensors out in 191 campuses. So I imagine you are picking up some interesting signals out there. What are you finding is happening more from a bottom up kind of grassroots? What's happening at individual colleges and universities? What are faculty doing to kind of either embrace this stuff or maybe disrupt some of the existing model of higher ed instructional delivery?
It varies wildly, and it's sort of the full spectrum. I mean, some faculty have pushed back toward, blue books or writing in class, and it has advantages and disadvantages.
Orals too, as well. Yeah.
Yes, if class size will allow, that's definitely a strategy, and there's definitely places where we've seen that, like in Europe, there's been a real resurgence of the oral exam. So I do think these are tools that belong in our toolbox, but I don't know that those are the best assessment methodology across the board for everything. So you have, some that have pushed back into sort of these strategies, those ancient times. Like I bought blue books, whenever I was an undergrad, for every exam period and often for midterms and the like. So I'm familiar with the modality.
Still have cramps in my hand, I think, from some of those longer tests. Yeah.
Well, it's so funny. I had a friend invite me at a local college where I live to come in and see them for a midterm. They were excited that they were resisting AI and wanted me to come in and watch the students take their midterm. So I'm in there and, everyone's got a blue book, and he was quite proud of the strategy. And we talked obviously at length, but about 10 minutes in, it caught my eye. We're standing over sort of the corner of the classroom in a big lecture hall. And I saw, this, a lot of students just about 10 minutes in, because they don't write all the time.
Right.
So we got a half hour in, and I was like, this is kind of a disaster because they're, they physically can't do the task of the run of, an hour and a half of handwriting. So, there's things that we need to consider as we think about such strategies. And then there's others where we see, the policy for the assignment provides guidance regarding how you can or cannot use AI. Like in courses where you're teaching how to write, I mean, often it's a challenge for, say, those in freshman running to kind of have ideas for what to write about.
Right.
So I've seen some assignments or assessments where you can use AI as a brainstorming partner to kind of come up with ideas, but you have to do the writing yourself. Or you write something yourself and you can ask AI for recommendations for improvement, but you do the writing yourself. In other words, writing is reserved for the student, but AI could be used for other processes. And in some cases, faculty are providing the prompt.
Right.
You could use one of these 3 prompts or whatever it might be. So, those are among the strategies that are kind of emerging out there. There was a thread probably about the last time we chatted, this notion of an AI resistant assignment, that you could craft something in such a way that it would be impossible for a student to leverage AI. And in preparation for the first book, we sort of put this notion in front of students in a focus group. And I just asked, does this feel like an AI resistant assignment to you? Like you couldn't use AI? And I had a student say, I could use AI. Well, you got your laptop, why don't you show me? And sure enough, they could kind of break through, ask it to write a draft that's just 2 pages in length, written like an 8th grader versus a draft, that's a little longer, so in other words, iterations of drafts and things. The creative student that's destined, to cheat can certainly make choices to figure out how to get around whatever structures we might have in our assignments. But I do feel that we're at a point in higher ed where we don't just need to have some guidance at an institutional level that probably aligns with your academic integrity system or your honor code or whatever it is.
Acceptable use,
And not only should we have some statement on our syllabus, I think that given that the outcomes that we aspire for our students vary from one assignment to the next, I think every assignment now should address AI. Like, no, you can't use AI for this assignment, or yes, you can, and here's how.
Right.
But I also think if we say no, we need to tell them why.
Yes.
We need to be transparent about our pedagogical decisions. Well, no, you can't use AI here because you don't have the foundational knowledge to be a collaborator with AI. So I'm teaching you those foundational skills, and maybe next semester you'd be allowed to use AI, but making it transparent. I mean, when you look at flipping the classroom, a lot of the research on why there was resistance from students regarding, being asked to do problem sets in class or whatever the difficult activities in class may have been. The reason there was resistance is students didn't understand why they were being asked to do it. Like, I have had great success sitting in lectures and taking notes and taking your exams. Why now in this class am I having to do a lot of work, in class? But where you see it being successful, where it was successful during sort of the heyday of flipping the classroom, it was when faculty explained why.
Yeah.
It's like, well, the research is really around cognitive processing. If you do the work, then you're more likely to learn. And so that's why I want you to be in class working on things. And it's going to be difficult, but we're going to provide you with support. And if you get stuck, we'll help you. And, all of that kind of transparency regarding pedagogical choices. Students are more likely to follow what we recommend if we're clear about why we're doing things a certain way. So that needs to be an ethic in most assignments these days.
Yeah. I like that you're mentioning ethics too, because it does feel like whether we like it or not, ethics is no longer like an afterthought or a checkbox where, the existing system just continues to hum along. And we make sure from a compliance perspective, we're training people on ethics, but we're also kind of not really spending a lot of time on it. The problem for a lot of folks nowadays is we all are grappling with stuff for which there aren't, easy answers. And what I liked about what you were putting out there too, beyond the ethics, is also the motivation and, incentives where when it's this adversarial environment around, we're going to catch you cheating, you better not cheat, it can kick off in some people like, oh, I can't crack this test, check me out. And some of those folks may drop out of higher ed and found, big tech companies and do other things. But, there is a sense of like, you almost don't want to be turning people off in terms of how you frame it. And you almost want to be awakening people to the fact that some of these ethical problems, it's also in their best interest to comply. And if it's less of a, we're going to cheat proof it, it's more, we're going to incentivize you to do it the right way.
I think that that's definitely the case. Is like we want to make transparent what the purpose is of our instructional processes, and that there are times when maybe AI is a answer to the question of how do we best teach our students to be able to do X, Y, or Z, especially if there's something that we're preparing them for in life beyond graduation that likely would have an AI component. Well, then logically that's where we should be teaching that. But there's probably other places in our curriculum where it doesn't belong. But I do feel probably every institution in higher education now has to see AI literacy as essential learning while students are in college. This doesn't mean that everyone on campus is using AI or teaching AI.
Yes.
It means that someone should.
Mm-hmm.
There should be someone somewhere in the curriculum. We have our curriculum map. We know the pathway students take through our curriculum and where's the logical places that we should teach this. Maybe it's the genetic experience to gain sort of a generic version of AI literacy, but maybe it's that last semester course or that capstone course right before students leave for the real world, that they develop those AI literacy skills that match exactly what the employer will be expecting them to do whenever they hit the world of work.
Yeah. And coincidentally, my wife was attending a technology summit at CUNY here in New York. You were a keynote. She already knew about you because she's a fan of Trending in Ed and had already read the book and was impressed by what you put out there. But I hear there are some new frameworks that you're working on in the book as well around like how to go about this stuff. Can you share any of that for our listeners? I haven't had a chance to look at the book, so I'd love to hear from you what's going on that front.
Well, yeah, I mean, one of the questions that I get most as I go from one campus to the next is, what do we teach our students? It's like, things are changing so quickly. And if we invest a summer in developing new things for a particular course, and then we teach it to our students. How do we know that this is what they need to know 2 years in the future? And I don't have a crystal ball for sure, but for the book, one thing that we did is we looked at the variety of different frameworks that have emerged regarding AI literacy. UNESCO has one, DEC has one, there's one from Barnard College, one from Stanford, Canterbury, Open University. We looked at all of these, and then we kind of developed, what I've been sort of thinking of as a meta AI literacy model, like what's in common to all of these different models. And it was interesting, a lot of them sort of riffed on Bloom's taxonomy. Like we take the 6 levels and then collapse them into categories or something.
Full disclosure, Eddie, when I hear, I've been around education for 20 years, Bloom's taxonomy makes me want to jump out a window. And it's nothing against Bloom, but I just feel like I can feel my eyes glazing over and I'm trying to resist.
Well, there's a lot of models out there.
Yeah.
And so we just looked at what did we feel was sort of missing across those models? And then what are the commonalities? And so we sort of we resisted sort of like putting together like a graphic and a framework, but we just sort of have in our new AI literacy chapter, sort of like, these are the things that we likely need to be teaching students that would prepare them for the future. I mean, one is like a broader mindset that AI doesn't do the work for you, but rather it does the work with you.
Yes.
And you are the executive decision maker, and you have to own anything that's produced by AI that you might put forward out in your career or within a class setting. So therefore, you need to make sure your fingerprints are all over every last intellectual thought within whatever it is that AI might produce. So that's, one component is recognizing there's a lot of work to use AI. You're not outsourcing and you're done, but rather you have to manage it. You have to make sure that doesn't have bias or faulty information on down the line, or that the voice speaks to the right audience, the like. So, we kind of talk through all of those components that, give a sense of like, these are probably the core things given the wisdom from all of these other models and my experience and my co-author's experience, Jose's experience as well. We kind of put together what we felt would be good guidance until we maybe get to the 3rd edition, but this certainly seems to kind of have a sense of where the landscape is and what the current needs are around AI literacy in the world of work.
Yeah, and the word practical is in your title there for a reason. That was my read on the 1st edition, and even the fact that you go back to the 1st edition and look for the more durable components of your first run at this stuff, because we are all learning from our amateur predictions. Some of our predictions might be better informed than others, but we're all trying to figure out what's coming next, and we're making mistakes, and there's room to kind of revisit models and refine them. But what I like about what you're doing is you're kind of providing folks with more durable tools and mindsets, which I'm also glad you kind of mentioned that word, because I've been gravitating towards it, where the skills have much shorter half-lives, where you learn a skill, especially a more hard, like how to prompt engineer, Gemini 2 point whatever, that's, you got to go in with the awareness that that thing is going to change, and those skills themselves may not be as relevant, but if you can transfer them, and, learning transfer to me comes from almost like a metacognition around like, who am I as a learner? How do I figure out what's working for me, and how am I always trying to hone and improve my craft? It does feel like there's an element of almost like a model of the instructional designer, the professor, the teacher, as like a craftsperson who is, making something, special, bespoke, artisanal, like all those kinds of words, but also doing so in a way that is like smart and efficient and like leveraging what's just emerging. Have you done a little bit of that as well? Like almost like a model of the AI powered instructor? How are you thinking about that side of things?
Well, yeah, very very much. Kind of my whole career has been focused there. Whenever I taught my first course as a TA, I remember I was just sort of like navel gazing, thinking about the story from one class to the next. Okay, I'll do this, and then I shared this, and this is the logical flow of things. And then it was around Thanksgiving where I went, I wonder what the students are getting out of this, because I was just telling a story. I wasn't about, and so that's even how I got interested in sort of educational psychology and instructional design and the like. And so There are those of us that just naturally can tell a fascinating story and it engages us and we just natural teachers. But I think those are kind of few and far between. I think that, having some knowledge of like how learning works and how to structure things and what are some good instructional design practices can only improve the work that we do. And so that's really kind of baked throughout everything that we talk about. We talk about AI literacy as a learning outcome, now really an essential learning outcome for higher education.
Mhm.
What are the implications in terms of our curriculum, our pedagogical practice? So we kind of frame things that way, but we also talk a lot. We have a brand new chapter on simulations and custom bots and role playing AI. And so these are capabilities that whenever we wrote the first edition, they didn't exist within AI.
Mhm.
So these are lots of new classroom practice ideas. And there's a little bit of, research that is beginning to emerge that is really supportive of using AI as a tutor in collaboration with what you're actually doing in the classroom, especially if it's active learning rather than just simply lecturing. So it's very evidence-based, very much focused on, what we know about how humans learn, and there are these new capabilities. And so how do you might fold those in new, interesting ways. But
Right.
we're really, I think, trying to put a few extra tools in, a faculty member's toolbox regarding, how I might design instruction, how I might handle my next class, really in service to improving student learning within my class.
Yeah, makes sense. And, as you're talking, I'm also thinking about that same adversarial relationship we kind of want to avoid around cheating and academic integrity as like the only thing we're talking about, in relation to AI. I think the same risk is there with our faculty where, if you're not able to actually understand where they're coming from, and if they are resistant, you're not necessarily going to get them to, adopt this stuff by forcing it on them. Instead, there's more like a thoughtful engagement and almost showing your own work as someone who is investigating this stuff. How do you sort of make it transparent and, easier to navigate? Because the risk, I think, is the folks who are saying, I don't use AI. And that is a faction within higher ed. In fact, it's a relatively vocal faction when I look at my social media feed, whether it's, for me at least, it's LinkedIn and Facebook, where I'm friends with academics. And there is almost some virtue signaling around not using this stuff and sticking to your guns in terms of, what Plato and Aristotle were doing, Socrates back in the day. There is this sort of ambition to kind of stay true to the longstanding history of, the academic experience. Plenty of critiques I think we could lob against that, but it does feel like there is a meaningful argument to be had for not using this stuff. And I feel like it's probably one that's worth engaging.
Well, Ohio University, their Center for Teaching and Learning, has a great model for engaging the campus. I think they've got like 6 or 7, maybe 8 statements within it. And, one statement, I think the first one is that, AI is not going away. And so, which is suggestive that probably each higher ed institution needs to be figuring out how to prepare students for a world where AI is going to be present.
Yeah.
Again, that doesn't mean everyone's teaching it, but it means someone is.
Right.
But I think their third or fourth item on their website is we need to embrace the skeptics. We need to hear their resistance points so that we do this well. So it's not just, hey, we're excited about it. I'm having fun with it. We're going to do this. But no, rather like, how do we do this? I think the key thing is when done well. Like, how do we do this well? And it's important to understand the resistors' perspectives, whether it's around academic integrity or ethical concerns or data concerns or the environment or just, resistance to changing the discipline and why you wouldn't want the discipline to change. What's the merits in it being the same? But those conversations, faculty need to be having holistically, and we want those that are excited as well as those that are the biggest skeptics to be in conversation so that we can see the different perspectives. And then as an institution or as a department, move forward and do this work well.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it's almost like, how do you facilitate that coming together and embracing skepticism and not sort of requiring groupthink is almost running counter to the broader culture nowadays, where it's more like, how do I find my affinity group and we all just agree on everything. You mentioned chatbots. We've been talking about chatbots on this podcast since 2016. And I like to talk about the era we're in as Clippy's revenge, where, we were tough on Clippy when he was part of our Microsoft, for those of us who remember, the kind of annoying paperclip bot that was helping us. That was my sort of root model of the bots. But that was 20 years ago, and now they're coming back in a different way. It sounds like you went a little deeper into some of what's emerging around, chatbots and simulations. What have you learned on that front?
It's really interesting. But just recently, I used a chat bot within the last 3 or 4 days on a particular company's website.
Yeah.
I was just so disappointed that it wasn't an AI chat bot. It was just, it was just basically a database of information and it had canned responses. But, chat bots that can be responsive and reflexive and also have a set of data that it's drawing these responses from, so many you probably have used, Notebook LM, where you put in your own information, and then as you interrogate it, it's drawing answers just from that closed set of information. I mean, some institutions have put in all of the federal guidelines regarding IRB as well as their campus rules.
Right.
So then you as a faculty member, you're doing your IRB.
And you have a deeper expertise around open educational resources too, right? Like OER, which is another, I think you even may have mentioned that on our previous episode, where could that be a place where you look for your ground truths?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you could, if you're teaching an intro to biology class and you're using the OpenStax Intro to Biology open free textbook, you could place that into the small language model or a system that the chatbot is drawing from. And so a student could then interrogate the course textbook, ask questions about whatever it is within biology. That could be really helpful for the learning process. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of unique, interesting, exciting opportunities with chatbots. And, some of them is, pretend you are a certain person from history or a fictional character. I actually was on a campus recently that was a faith-based campus, and they had a chatbot where they had loaded in everything that Jesus had said.
Yeah.
And so you could have a conversation with a generative AI Jesus chatbot.
The Black Mirror fan in me is resisting any dystopian scenarios based on what you just described there. But I mean, my head does go there, where the other reason people don't want to use AI is if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And if the thing I might fix my delivery with is coming from sort of shady sources, why even lean in? And that's where, some of the AI skepticism that I still have around the foundational models is, kind of shady practices around the original scraping of the intellectual property. And then at least up until recently, really poor attribution of when they say something, what are the sources that's based on. I will say it does look like the big companies are kind of starting to respond to that, building that into the foundational models. But, the ethics, which you mentioned earlier, I think is probably an important place to spend a little time on as well. Like what's appropriate use of this stuff and how do you even define it when the folks who are giving you these platforms can't even explain some of this stuff themselves?
Yeah, I feel the struggle internally regarding, best practice or what would be the recommendations that I would provide as I go from one campus to the next, or as we think about, what we might put in the next book.
Yeah.
Because there are these concerns. I mean, and I think if you look at your own research, you can find your fingerprints within AI. There was a point where I needed just like a summary of work regarding AI, for like forget what it was. Maybe it was a conference proposal or whatever. And I just, I need 150 words. And he gave me 150 words. And I was like, wow, that's great. I love that. And there was a little link where I could see, the citations. And then it was me. No wonder I loved that. It was something I had written that it had scraped, and that was in the large language model. So I was kind of excited but frustrated by it. And so there's been an enormous theft of IP, without a doubt, that underscores these. And of course, we've seen this movement, like where, different models like Taylor and Francis have sold access to their, So there's a lot of examples of where the AI companies are now buying access to quality.
Or trying to, in the case of Scarlett Johansson's voice, famously. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So this is the complexity of the decision-making that I've done and why I've come out where I am. I guess ultimately I go, wow, these tools, the companies have made some choices that I think most in higher ed would go, that's problematic.
Mhm.
But then I also see on the other end of this, that's like, wow, the world of work has rapidly adopted these things regardless of the ethical concerns.
Right. Mhm.
And so then I think the end of the day, I kind of come between these two tensions. I have students in front of me.
Yeah.
And so I'm thinking, what do I do that's best for these students who are accumulating debt to be in my classroom,
Right.
they're here specifically because they're hoping for social mobility or a better
Yeah.
life, whenever they graduate. And so there's this messy ethical landscape, but I think ultimately I've got these students in front of me that I have to prepare them for that world,
Yeah.
that I'm not thrilled about this world, but is it a better choice for me to deny them the education that they require upon graduation because of my ethical concerns? Or you weigh these things out. And I think, different people's logics and value systems may lead to different conclusions. But where I landed was, the purpose of higher ed really is around preparing students for,
Life.
what happens after those 4 years or whatever.
Yeah.
And I think we have to figure out how to provide them with those knowledge, skills, abilities that will enable them to navigate that world successfully. I mean, I think that I don't know this, but I've thought that maybe this current moment and this particular challenge that you've raised around ethics might be similar to some of the thought processes of humanity after the atom bomb became sort of known to the entirety of the globe. Wow. I think I really wish that didn't exist, but that's not going away.
Right.
So what do we do?
Mhm.
And I think that might be my position around AI is like, I kind of wish it didn't exist,
Right.
but it's not going away. So what do we do in
Mhm.
this context where there's this sort of sketchy IP landscape that really a lot of the world of work is using?
Yeah.
What do we do? And I feel like for me, I think we have to focus on the students who are at our institutions who ultimately are responsible for our careers and our salaries. We need to do what's best for them.
Mhm.
And that means prepare them with the skills they need post-graduation.
Yeah. And, right in line with that, I think, is some critical thinking that's applied to the use of AI that ideally a college graduate will come out because with that skill set and that approach, because that's also what folks are hiring for. And also going in with more of a kind of clear-eyed understanding of what's in there, I think comes with a little bit of criticality. Like I think of AI literacy as also building on some of the awakenings around social media and media literacy, screen addiction, the personal well-being and mental health components of how you use this technology is also coming much more to bear. And to me, that's where there's almost like a level of like civic training that is still part of the mission of higher ed, which is the straight ahead way in which you were describing where you landed. I think just being transparent around the struggle and the fact that the answers aren't clear, which is in some ways, that's one of the biggest things I got out of my undergraduate experience was understanding that, it's Dunning-Kruger. Like as you start going further in to understand the complexity here, you realize, oh, that more simplistic understanding I had at the beginning, I was kind of missing it. And if you can kind of elevate folks' mindsets, ultimately you'll be preparing them for that world of work you were talking about.
Yeah, and it's not just the ethical concerns, which there was an Amazon Web Services survey a couple of years back that asked employers, like, what skills do you need to use AI well? And in the top 5, ethics was one of them. 5 skill.
Yeah.
So this is something that's part of an AI literacy going forward, but it's not just about the ethical concerns and how that might influence usage. It's also about, is it a bad idea? Like, for instance,
Right.
you go to the doctor and you have some blood work done, or you have an ultrasound and you get back the results in MyChart.
Yeah.
Is it a good idea to copy and paste those results into an AI and say, give me a layman's understanding of these test results?
Mm-hmm.
Is that a good idea? Well, there's pros and cons.
That's the question.
And so, if it's an interesting activity for those of you that have an account that you have your username and password for, for an AI, just ask it, hey, I use you quite often. What do you know about me?
Mm.
that summary of what's been collected about you may surprise you. I mean, we don't remember every Google search we've ever done, and we certainly don't remember every prompt that we've asked an AI. But I did that recently, and I was like, wow, I thought I was being judicious in the ways that and I believe that I was, but there's still things that I might ask here or there about, a friend's health or something like that. Like one of my close friends, his mother been diagnosed recently, and I was just wanting to know more about what they were dealing with. And, wow, it captured that, but it also ascribed that to being my. So, I can imagine in the future there being a data breach where it doesn't just have your name and credit card and the address. It also have every prompt you've ever asked in that AI along with the responses. So there's a lot of just best practice concerns that we need to be teaching our students.
Yeah. And also getting comfortable with being uncomfortable, to use the cliche, but I think it's true around a lot of this stuff where, like even the way you were describing the personal struggle, which I empathize with, I think I share it in that, like, I know the IP is shady, but the outputs are still pretty remarkable and they're getting better. And, at some point we just have to figure out how to go to work each day. But I think making it more about the shared human experience of using these tools critically, thoughtfully, ethically, and in service of meaningful outputs. Amazing conversation. Clearly, Eddie, we can go long. I want to be conscious of your time and our listeners' time. So as we wrap up here, what have we not talked about? Any ways of framing this up for our listeners as we release them back to the rest of their lives?
The epilogue of our book, we talk about what are the implications for the profession of professor. And I think these are implications that we haven't seen enacted yet, but we see there being a reasonable probability that this might occur because of some of the questions that we're receiving from higher ed leaders in different settings and different contexts where Jose and I speak. So an example of this is if you think about all of the tasks of teaching, whether it's syllabus development or course design or putting together a lecture, all the way through grading. The learning management systems have all come out with tools that address all of those, including what's often been the third rail, which is grading, right? There's lawsuits at some institutions where students have discovered their faculty members are using it for grading, and they've pushed back. And so, number one, transparency is a good best practice. But the question that I'm hearing here and there from leaders in higher ed is if all of these tasks can now be performed by an AI. So not suggesting that, it replaces faculty, but a faculty member who might have, let's say, a 4 and 4 load. And if they're using it for a variety of different things, including grading, might this save several hours each week? So in a 40-hour work week, might it take that 40 hours down to maybe just 34 or maybe even 32 hours? That's the question. Like, is it possible that AI could save labor, improve the quality of instruction, and actually have efficiencies where faculty have time saved?
Yeah.
Then the follow-up question is like, hey, we have some fiscal challenges, we have some enrollment challenges, we're struggling with the bottom line. Might AI enable us to fire many of the adjuncts and increase class sizes? Because that's always been the pushback point, right? Is that in those writing classes, we can't have more than 20 or 25 students because that would be too much to grade. If AI could do the grading, doesn't this mean we can increase class sizes? And I don't think that's an orthogonal way to think about it. If the core challenge you're struggling with are bottom line challenges, I could see why you might go there with AI. But I guess I would also push back a little bit and say, well, what's the core purpose of our instructional mission? And I think the core purpose is around the students, right? So if that's the core purpose, then what do we know about student learning and student success? And maybe we should lean into that. And, if you think about student learning and student success and you look at the research on it, the greatest predictor isn't grade point average in high school, though that's a pretty good predictor. It's not ACT scores. It's not socioeconomics, though all of these have predictor, percentages. The greatest predictor is you. It's the professor. If you have a really good professor, you're then likely to learn and you'll have a connection to the professor and you'll want to stay in college. I told my sons when they went to college, I said, just find whoever won the teaching award last semester and take their class.
That is great advice.
So my son came back to me when he was a freshman and said, Dad, you remember that advice? the course is on the Baltics. Are you sure I should take this course? And I had a very quick calculus and did not show my questioning, but I stuck with my advice and I said, yes, take that course.
Yeah.
At graduation day, I asked him, what was the most memorable thing that happened in college? And he said, well, Dad, I've been waiting for you to ask me that. It was actually that Baltics course. That was the best class I ever had. And he started telling me all of the stuff about the Baltics that he learned 3.5 years ago. Yeah. And it was like, well, that's it. And in fact, if I ask you or anyone, what's the most memorable thing that happened to you as an undergraduate in terms of learning? In terms
thank you for clarifying.
What's the most memorable thing that happened? No one's going to say, there was this PowerPoint on a Wednesday that I'll never forget. It's the time that a professor pulled them aside and made them feel like they belong. We know that belonging is one of the reasons why students stay in college, so maybe, I guess we have two different versions of the future, and this is a false binary, right? I mean, one is where we fire the adjuncts and increase class sizes. There's another possibility where maybe we take those extra hours and we develop a new signature pedagogy for higher ed where we engage our students. Instead of them having maybe 1 or 2 life-changing experiences throughout their academic career, maybe they have 1 or 2 life-changing experiences a month. I think there's an opportunity, if AI really does prove to have the ability to diminish the number of hours it's required to do the entirety of the tasks of teaching, maybe we can reinvest in new kinds of strategies with our students where we connect with them more, where we mentor them more, where we make them feel like they belong at the institution. Yeah. So those are the two poles. And I guess ultimately we're going to see some institutions are going to be more toward one versus another. But my advice to faculty is, if you haven't heard this conversation on your campus yet, start it. Yeah. Go to faculty senate, raise this question, ask your department chair, has the dean talked about class sizes in AI? These are the conversations we need to start having now to make sure that we have a shared perspective on the future of the professoriate and what higher education is going to look like.
Fantastic answer. I have plenty of follow-ups, but I'll withhold them for potential future engagement. Eddie Watson, the book is called Teaching with AI. I'm holding the old version, but show what's just dropped. All right, Eddie, thank you so much for joining me on today's show.
Thank you, Michael.
And for our listeners, if you liked what you heard, tell your friends, subscribe, check out our higher ed feeds and our AI feeds, which are coming in 2026. This is Trending in Education.